Okay, everyone, welcome back. Hope you had a good lunch. Great to see so much energy in the room. And we hope that you can bring it to bear on this afternoon's discussions. In the morning, we started with individual behavior. We moved on to the behavior of groups and civil society and communities. And there's a sense in which we're getting bigger and bigger in scale. So this afternoon's presentations are broadly speaking at the macro level. And in this session, we have three quite distinct, separate presentations. One of them is not from SLRG. And I make absolutely no apologies for that, for the very good reason that actually one of the projects that sadly had to be dropped when our funding was cut in two and we became deceptively spacious was one on materialism and the impact of materialism on people's lives. And this is such a big meta process, a big meta fact about sustainable living, about living of any kind, the kind of culture that we live in, and the role that materialism plays in that culture, that it simply can't really be ignored. It can't be left out of the room, even when it's left out of the funding. And there's a message, too, for academics who think that they're the only people who can possibly answer the most important question of all. Of course, we're not. We didn't get funded to do it, but Helga did, and she has worked in this area for a long time and has made fantastic progress. And what I asked her to talk about, because I thought it was such important work, as a guest invited lecture here this afternoon, is a few meta-studies that she's done looking at the relationships between materialism, the environment, and well-being. So it's with a great, great pleasure and a huge privilege to ask Helga to talk to you now.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Can I say, from my viewpoint, it's a real honor to be invited today here to be able to talk to you about some of our research. And it's been a real pleasure. I found this morning so interesting. But in the interests of time, let's get straight in there. And I personally quite like a talk that starts with the conclusion it's going to give you. Here we are. Materialism, a system that eats us from the inside out. And that's, in a way, where I'm going to get to. This is a Guardian article by George Monbiot, who's actually talking about some of the research I carried out with a number of international collaborators. And the point is that a materialistic value orientation at the core of consumer culture actually has quite dire consequences, not only for ourselves, but also for the planet. But after these very serious words, I know it's just after lunch, and I thought I need to wake you all up. This is a consumer culture quiz. Now, here are some randomly selected advertisements, and you'd be really excused if you thought they might be advertising the same product, because they look quite similar, really. But no, it's very different products, and I'm inviting you now to shout out and tell me what the products are. We'll start here at the top left. In fact, this is for the same product, which I've cunningly hidden. Any offers? What? Good, I like socks, I haven't had that before. Perfume? Right, okay, well, I'll put you out of your misery. It's in fact coffee. I mean, it was obvious. This must be the lunch still having an effect. Okay, let's move on to this nice image here. Any offers? Underwear. Toilet paper. I went for toilet paper. You are wrong, though. Underwear, clothes? Anything else? I think it's for underarm deodorant, if I'm right. But it's the third one I love the most. Any offers? Mattress, good. Still quite functional mattress. Okay, well, I doubt you would have guessed that, so I'll show you. It's for Lego. Obviously, I mean, kind of, how could you miss that? I mean, I'm not telling you anything new about consumer culture and advertising, but in a way, I just want to spend a couple of minutes to say something about the myths and maybe partially the absurdity of the messages that we are being targeted with, whether we like it or not, as well as our children. Okay, so let me just click the second one in. Quick question, ideal appearance and body. I just want to give you a couple of examples. You've got beautiful Barbie doll here and some action toy figure. And the idea is this is heavily marketed at children. What appearance and body ideals are we actually marketing at them? And anthropometrists have very interesting ways of scaling people. So for instance, this is Barbie, and this is Libby, who is a BBC commentator. And you can see here they are next to each other, not looking that similar really, but what you can do, you can actually keep Libby at the same height as Barbie, and then take Barbie's body proportions and scale Libby down. So that's what she would look like if she's kept at the same height as Barbie. You can then say, okay, well, let's do it differently. She can be as tall as she wants to be, but we're keeping her waist circumference the same. And hey-ho, this is Libby at about 2 meters 57, I believe. But I mean, my point simply is these ideals are not very realistic, biologically impossible. And in fact, you know, the hunky figure you saw, the bodybuilder, this person, if they really existed, a blood and flesh man would topple over because the muscle mass is too heavy for the skeletal structure to carry it. So that's the sort of thing that we are doing in advertising. So we've got materialistic and consumer culture values, wealthy, attractive people presented as cultural ideals we should strive towards, buying lots of material goods, looking good, offered as a mean towards achieving an ideal self and happiness. This is the sort of myth we're being presented with. And I'll move on to the reality of the research, but I just wanted to give you the definition we've been using, where a materialistic value orientation, we say, is the endorsement of values, goals, and associated beliefs that center on the importance of acquiring money and possessions for conveying status and image. So it's not just about striving for money and consumer goods, there is quite a lot of associated package. But let me go into the research, and Tim has already referred to the fact that we carried out a meta-analysis which was funded by the ESRC. And just for those who might not be familiar, the real strength of a meta-analysis is that you're not stuck with a single piece of research, but you actually identify all the relevant studies in a particular field, in our case, studies that had a measure of materialism in it or a measure of well-being, and then you actually, if you like, throw all the studies in a pot, stir it round, and out comes a statistic which gives you something called an average effect size. This is what we did. And we had over 250 studies and 753 effect sizes. I will never forget it. It was quite an ambitious project, and it was quite hard to do. Okay, so let me kind of walk over here and point out a few things about this particular figure. First of all, if you look at it, the first thing to notice is that all of the effects, which I'll say more about in a minute, are negative. There isn't a positive effect, and we had scaled this such that negative numbers mean that greater materialism is linked to lower personal well-being. So everything is negative, and what we then did, we actually cast our net widely in terms of what you might want to call personal well-being. Psychologists often talk about something called subjective well-being, which is represented in yellow here, which is people's long-term view of how satisfied they are with their lives and whether they typically experience positive and hopefully not very many negative emotions. That is, you have lower subjective well-being the more materialistic you are. Then we also looked at what we called self-appraisals, things like self-esteem or self-doubt or self-discrepancies. The more materialistic you are, the worse your self-appraisal. As I said, this is coded in such a way that they all go in the same direction. Then you might say, well, clearly mental health is seen as a widely used indicator of personal well-being. you're more anxious, you show more depressive symptoms, and a much higher level of compulsive buying symptoms. The more materialistic you are, this is quite a large effect size. And then finally, we decided to include measures of physical health as well, which seem a bit more removed from the idea of a materialistic value that we might internalize. Well, for physical health too, we get significant negative effects. So, what this shows, although there's some differences between the different types of well-being, all of the effects are negative, they're all significant, and this is the first study which could actually show that materialism is linked to lower well-being in really very, very different dimensions of well-being. And we did a great many analysis further than that, asking questions like, yeah, but does this relationship, this negative relationship, change or differ depending on the characteristics of people, how old they are, whether they're male or female, the environment they work in, whether it supports materialism or not? I mean, you could say in business and advertising, materialism might be more supported as a value system than in the context of, saying, working as a nurse in a hospital. Does that make a difference to that negative link? What about different countries? What about countries that are either more affluent, less affluent, have different cultural values? How are these things affected? Well, there is very much I could say. You can read it. It's 128 pages long. You can use it as a doorstop. But I want to just give you a couple of things. The first is the overall take-home message. It's an extremely robust negative link. The headline story here is that it's robust, with very few and small exceptions, across the characteristics of the study. Didn't matter which particular method they used, how big the sample was, when the study was conducted. Robust across characteristics of individuals, including income, which we hadn't actually expected. Robust across, we actually had countries representing all 5 continents across the world, and countries with different economic structures, such as the extent to which, if you like, you have a free market economy or not, or levels of affluence, GDP. That wasn't a moderator. You get the same kind of negative effects of the same magnitude, and also across countries with different value systems, including countries who have, if you like, a higher emphasis on materialism at a high level than countries who maybe have less. So it's extremely robust. And that's really the main take-home message from this analysis. There's a couple of small examples where I think it's worth me saying where we had small exceptions, because they relate very much to the sorts of themes we're talking about today. So I'll show you these quite briefly. So if you look at the two, and keep remembering, everything is negative. We didn't find anything positive. The two red bars refer to what we call cultural level values. Just as you as individuals have values, you can aggregate, you can look at the average values, which are maybe more highly endorsed in one country rather than in another. And effective autonomy is the extent to which people, or to which the pursuit of pleasure and fun for yourself is highly emphasized. So you could say it's a hedonism value at a cultural level, and that makes a difference. So if you live in a country where this kind of self-focused hedonism and pursuit of your own pleasures is highly culturally sanctioned, in a country, we've picked Denmark, that was an example, you actually find that the relationship is more negative, i.e. the more materialistic you become, the extent to which your well-being lowers is greater than if, for instance, you live in a country, this is Egypt as an example, which isn't very focused on this sort of self-oriented hedonism. So that was a significant moderator or something, a factor that changed the relationship. And also economic growth. which I thought would be interesting in the context here. So if you take a country that has slow economic growth, here is the US, you actually get a more negative effect, a stronger effect size than if you take a country like India, which has fast economic growth. Now, I don't know whether you think this is potentially counterintuitive, that it should be that way round. It's difficult because the rate of economic growth is confounded to some extent with GDP and GNP. There is a number of economic factors which all work together. So what is also the case, of course, about India, not only has it got faster economic growth, in fact quite astronomical, it is also, it has quite a bit of a lower level of affluence than the US. So this is kind of a finding where you can see it becomes difficult to untangle interrelated factors. But that's, I mean, I could say lots and lots and lots about the meta-analysis, which is just about to come out. We're waiting for the proofs. But it does show quite conclusively, I think, that there really is a robust and significant link between a materialistic value orientation and lower well-being across a whole range of domains. And when we actually collected our studies for the meta-analysis, we didn't only focus on individuals' well-being, we also looked at studies which had measured some form of maybe environmental or social well-being. So as part of this, and this is already published as a paper, was published last year, we actually looked directly at how a materialistic value orientation would relate to, I've called it environmentalism here. What we looked at is we measured, or we classified studies either measuring pro-environmental or environmental friendly attitudes on the one hand, and then we also had environmentally friendly behaviors. I'm sure carbon footprint is something I don't even need to explain, but also issues about whether you believe that we actually are interconnected or have a responsibility towards preserving planetary resources on a sort of less self-focused and more global level. And the findings are quite similar. If anything, these effects are slightly larger. Very clear, very consistent. The more materialistic you are, the less likely, the lower your environment, you have less environmentally friendly attitudes, and you engage in more behaviors that are environmentally costly. So the message is really, I think, very clear throughout. We can go in the questions to some more of this, but I really, really would like to also spend just a little bit of time telling you about another project or research program we've been doing for the last 3 years, which was funded by Leverhulme. The reason being that what I've shown you so far are studies which almost invariably are focused on adults. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about the Children Consumer Culture project we've been working on for about 3 years now, which is a 3-wave longitudinal research project with over 2,000 kids in East Sussex. And if you just take the sort of snapshot, correlational snapshot, like we did in the meta-analysis, you get a similar picture. Children who focus on materialistic and appearance ideals are more depressed, less happy with their body and weight, suffering more physical symptoms of ill health, and they are actually less liked by their peers. But there is a lot of other things we investigated in this project, and again, I'm just picking out a few things which I think are important also in terms of the policy, maybe discussions we'll have a little bit later on. Okay, now, these are kids in classrooms, and what you can do, you can develop sociograms. What you can do, you can ask the children, you can say, okay, now look around in your class and please list up for me who are the 3 kids you most like to play with. This is an indicator of liking, if you like. Who are the 3 kids who have the most stuff? You know, we're talking about mobile phones and kit and so on. Who are the 3 kids who look the best? So the kids make nominations, and we can then translate this into a number per child. So we can actually look at how often they were nominated and what that means. So for instance, let's pick somebody who's popular. Here we have got Josh. Josh is very popular because, well, he's green because he's popular, but he's got many arrows going into him, which means he was nominated by that number of children in his classroom. Whereas if we pick, say, poor Emily here, who is a rejected child, hence the black spot, she has nominated children, but she wasn't nominated by anybody. Now, we have loved these sorts of sociograms because they're objective data and not self-report. And in terms of, let me see that I can get the sequence clear because this is not shown in this picture. But what we actually found out is that children have a very strong belief. They believe that those kids who have the most stuff and those kids who look the best are also the kids who are most popular. That's what comes out of these sociograms. It's a perfect translation of the consumer culture message we get as adults too. You know, if you have an iPhone 5 and God knows else what, you're going to be, you know, your relationships are suddenly going to transform and be absolutely fantastic. Your identity is brilliant. You're happy. You know, it's that sort of belief. And so we actually tested this. And what's interesting, because we had data of who are the 3 most popular kids in your class, so this is children's belief, but we also have the data on who do you actually most like to play with, i.e. actual liking. And I think if there is one finding I love most of this project is the kids who have the most stuff and the kids who look the best are not the most liked kids. This is a major myth-busting finding as far as we're concerned. We're still writing this up. It's not true. There is actually, the kids who are truly most liked are cooperative kids who engage in social activities, and having stuff and looking cool has got nothing to do with it. I just thought I'd share that with you because otherwise the talk's a bit doom and gloom, really. Okay, I told you it gets bad. Here now another aspect which I think is important. We've got so little longitudinal research because people say, yeah, okay, but so you don't know, is it the materialism that leads to lower well-being? Is people who've got well-being problems turn to materialism? Which way does the causality go? And et cetera, et cetera. So we actually had 3 time waves. So we studied these children at baseline and 8 months later and 6 months later. Now, let me try and kind of, this is all with structural equation modeling and lots of very fancy stats, but let's stick here for a minute. So if we look at children, what this means, the stronger the materialistic or consumer culture orientation a child had, the stronger that was, they actually showed more depressive symptoms 8 months later. And similarly, if we then look at the kids who at 8 months at that time point, the higher their consumer culture orientation, the more depressive symptoms they reported a further 8 months later. So, and these are significant. So there clearly is this trajectory from consumer culture orientation produces more depression at a later time point, okay? It also goes the other way. If you look at kids and you can see from this here that the greater the symptoms of depression children showed at baseline, the more likely they were to endorse a consumer culture orientation 8 months later. And again here, if we go at the first time point and look at depression, significant link, kids who were more depressed showed more consumer culture orientation a further 8 months later. So you get bidirectional effects. And what that means is both camps are right. I mean, a materialistic value orientation seems to lead to more depressed symptoms over time, if you like, undermining well-being. But there is also a sense in which kids who maybe already are depressed, trying to latch onto materialism and having the right stuff as a kind of, if you like, maladaptive coping strategy to improve their compromised well-being. And in effect, you can kind of actually think about a negative spiral that happens, no matter whether you look at how materialistic the kids are, how depressed they are. So if they are materialistic, they become more depressed. The more depressed they are, the more likely they are to take on board materialistic pursuits, and so down it goes. And this is depressed symptoms, but we thought let's look at a different sort of indicator of well-being. We also looked at body esteem, and in essence, the picture is identical. It shows the same bidirectional effect, suggesting a downward spiral. And that's important because it actually shows that these are long-term effects, and not only on children's well-being. We also, this is a study which has just been published, we actually looked at materialistic values in UK children and in Hong Kong Chinese children, asking the question, what does materialism do to their learning and to their school performance, to their exam performance? And these are, the, if you like, the time one findings. The more materialistic children were, the lower their exam performance, and these are actually quite powerful effects. We also found out that the mediating mechanism is materialism, because it's so much focused on external image and reputation, focuses or seems to focus children on a performance orientation in learning rather than what we might call deep learning, for the fun of it and for some intrinsic pleasure. So materialism seems to have this effect because it directly affects kids' learning motivation. So they don't want to learn in depth because they're curious and because it's fun. All they're thinking is, I want good grades so I can earn a lot of money in later life. And the causal hypothesis this time is actually supported only in that direction. The materialism leads to lower exam performance, and it does so in the longitudinal study we carried out. So the more materialistic kids were at time one, the worse their exam performance 1 year later. We also had some very nice experiments where we had we said, this is a video diary. You're going to see a child and they're going to tell you about what they like in life and what's important to them, etc. And so we had a materialistic version of this video diary child, or a non-materialistic version, and we then gave the children an alphabetic Sudoku, which was insolvable. But what we were interested in is, would they choose the harder or the easier one? Where we said, oh, one is quite challenging, but you learn a lot of really important new things, and the other one was, oh, it'll show the experimenter how good you can do this kind of thing. Which one do they choose? It's always the same one, the harder or the easier one, and how long did they actually sit there and try and work on this Sudoku? And we could show that once you've seen the materialistic peer model, kids would choose predominantly the easier Sudoku, and they actually stop more quickly. Their task persistence falls right off. So these are interesting triangulated data suggesting materialism really does undermine children's learning and exam performance. So given that there is, if you like, a kind of a package here in terms of findings, I think that is important. And let me just kind of summarize for a minute. So we've got strong correlational evidence now, I would say. Those with a stronger materialistic value orientation experience lower well-being and show less environmentally friendly attitudes and behavior. But on top of this correlational data, we have got longitudinal evidence in children, negative effects of materialistic values on well-being over time, and vice versa. But it's a kind of a negative downward spiral. And we have longitudinal evidence in children that materialism undermines learning and school performance. There are, of course, factors which make children more resilient and less resilient, which we're working on at the moment. But there is something coming out which we're working on, so I can't give too many details. But what's really interesting, because these kids are from 8 to 15, so it spans primary and secondary school, and we have looked at how much their values change. And if I had to put what it looks like, and as I said, we really need to confirm this, what it looks like in a nutshell, it is this. Values change in primary school a lot. By the time you go into secondary school, they start to set in concrete. This has a very important policy implication. Values are sticky, like habits. We did a study in Iceland where, we studied people through the economic collapse, thinking, wow, here's a field experiment opportunity because surely their materialistic values must change with the government preaching traditional values. How much change do you get, do you reckon? Very little. Values are hard to change. And I'm starting to arrive at the conviction, if you like, that if we really want to have very powerful interventions, we need to talk to kids and we need to talk to them in primary school settings. That seems to be the kind of main conclusion I want to come to. And I think I'll leave it here.
Okay, thank you very much, Helga. That was a tour de force and of clear interest to the project that we have set ourselves in, even talking about the subject of sustainable lifestyles. We've got a few minutes for questions, and so I think rather than take lots of talks, I'll take some questions in between. Yes, one over here, and then Rachel. So let's take 2 or 3 questions at the same time. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, here are really dangerous materialistic values, and this level of materialistic values is okay. This is a really difficult question. However, there is a very interesting American survey on undergraduate students, which they've been running for a long number of years. So this is hundreds of thousands of students, and let me see whether I can get it right. In 74, I think a third of the students said that earning lots of money and having expensive possessions is either very or essentially important to them as a life goal. In the latest study, it was over 80%. So we are looking at a massive value change if this large-scale undergraduate cohort keeping track over time is anything to go by.
Rachel here. Yeah, let's take a couple of questions. Mm-hmm. Oh, was there somebody on this table? Tara and Bas. Can we get another microphone up here?
Thank you. A question about materialism and learning. What was the relationship between materialism, learning, and the affluence of the child in question? That was my first question. The second is that really interesting network of who you want to be friends with.
Yeah.
It seemed to be that the people who had loads and loads of friends didn't seem to be signalling that they particularly wanted to be friends with other people. Much fewer.
Mm-hmm. Let me
hang on. We'll take one more. Abbas, if you can take the 2 at a time, that would be good.
First of all, thank you so much for this interesting talk. My question is actually very simple. Why do you think that materialism makes us miserable?
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll try and take them in order. In terms of, if you like, the socioeconomic context or background in the learning study, we had some data in terms of individual children and also schools. But we didn't feel we had sufficient data to actually study SES as a factor in its own right. So we took the other route that you can take. We statistically controlled for that. So we've taken, if you like, the impact that SES has on learning outcomes out of the equation. But there is some cross-cultural data which speak to your concern, which is that materialism in poorer countries becomes a little bit more like fulfilling basic survival needs that you have, because you have material wants, you have material deprivation. Whereas in more affluent countries, it is much more tied to symbolic status and those sorts of issues. So we know the meaning of materialism is a little bit different depending on SES, and there are some findings suggesting that if you take a materialism scale, you get higher scores in lower SES populations. Yeah.
And Bass's question, why does it make us unhappy?
Okay, how long have I got? Self-determination theory, which might mean something to several of you, postulates that we have basic needs that if we fulfill them, we'll have high well-being, and they are having close personal relationships, fulfilling personal relationships, a sense of agency that I have some power, if you like, to do what I do, I'm not coerced, and competence. And the idea is that having extrinsic values like materialism, which always depend on recognition by other people, etc., actually acts to frustrate and undermine psychological need fulfillment. There's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that this is a good explanation. You can say once you're insecure, the environment, consumer culture persuades you to adopt these maladaptive strategies. Got the solution. Retail therapy, you feel bad, go and buy stuff. I shop, therefore I am. You've got problems with your identity or self-esteem. Just go out and buy the right pair of shoes, you'll be sorted out forever. And so we've come up with a kind of a self-discrepancy account, sort of saying we get very idealistic and unrealistic depictions out there, and they've become social comparison points, and so we automatically lose out because we're not looking like these kinds of models, which has negative knock-on effects. They're not mutually exclusive. Sorry, that was a bit long.
Good. No, let's take another quick round of questions. I mean, I guess my question, I've been trained well by Lee and Zoe, is a sort of, so what should policymakers actually do at this point? Is this, I mean, this idea of you have to get to children at primary school level, is that it? I mean, is the rest of the population really kind of, all played out and materialistic till the end?
Let's just put it like that. If I don't know whether you have children, if you have a 5-year-old daughter, it's going to be, for me as a psychologist, going into a school and doing a school-supported intervention. My chances of persuading her to change her values about littering and having material goods is much better than persuading you. I think kind of, in a way, it would be easier. I think, but you can have intervention programs, this is where we're moving towards, which would be in the school curriculum, but which would involve children and their parents. And I wouldn't want to advocate that we cannot change values and activate different sorts of identity motives for people, no.
Yeah, okay, let's take a couple more questions. There's one here, Rachel, yes now, and then one at the back.
That the school as a setting itself has got more influence on the children and their value building than actually the parents, as when kids then move on to secondary school, their peer group becomes much more important for them. And
it's a very good question.
And me as a mum, I can just see with my daughter how much this has sort of changed actually with this peer group. So my question is, do you just push away these facts and just say, no, everything is done in primary school and it happens in school and the parents are kind of decoration?
It's a really, really good question. To me, it's not a more or less of influence, it's an and. If parents can talk about their children, I mean, consumer culture also has good aspects. I mean, but to be more critical and maybe less needy of 500 million props which you have to change every 5 minutes in this sort of throwaway mentality. It's important for parents to talk to their children. It's important that these issues get raised in school. Children are ostracized for having the wrong type of trainers. I mean, this has serious social isolation consequences. But it's an and thing, so if the school setting itself can support value change, doing it in classrooms where the kids are in groups and the peers are on board, and the children, and the parents as well, and then there's of course, media and all sorts of policies, it's an and approach. This is really powerful stuff. We better attack it or try and engage with it from all directions, so that would be my answer.
Okay, Rachel.
normal advice and way of thinking about things by suggesting a silver bullet. But I was wondering to what extent you know of any evidence about the possible kind of remediating effects in terms of working particularly with children of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy and meditation, because it's something that I've heard some really exciting and inspiring stories
Thank you very much, because that was one of the points I hadn't quite decided how I was going to bring it into here, so you've just done that for me, so thank you very much. We've already, I think mindfulness changes or focuses on changing from people from more extrinsic to more intrinsic values, to think about contentment and joy that resides in social interactions, relationships with people, peace, and not in material goods. I mean, there is evidence already, and we've done some research already, which shows that mindfulness seems an extremely promising candidate.
Okay, that might have provoked a few more questions. It seems to have done. Let me take Alma because she's got a mic, and then Lee, and then Graham.
Hi. Very, very interesting results. Thank you. I just wanted to go back to the question of materialism and the sort of meaning for different societies, groups, families. You know, how can you compare different countries? Perhaps you can explain a little bit more on the questions that were articulated in the different studies in different places as to how you can then compare responses and the different negative effects in different places. Perhaps
I'm really sorry. I think the mic is distorting you a bit. I haven't really understood your question. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. I can repeat. I'm thinking if you can perhaps explain a little bit more or give us some examples of a couple of countries that you were comparing, just to have a better understanding of the questions that were studied to compare the effects
thanks.
on well-being, on health. Do you see what I'm trying to say? I'm thinking of whether you can perhaps offer an example of Denmark. You spoke about Denmark, and the type of questions that were articulated to see the effects of
Great.
Lee.
Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm just sort of asking a question not from the perspective of a policymaker, which is a very, or even a policy advisor. It's a very dangerous sort of territory that I'm wading into. But I mean, I guess it seems that this is linked to, I think, Baz's point really, which is what's the logic behind the supposed correlation or the causality that might be there between materialism and well-being. And I guess my question is, if you see this as a universal thing across all cultures to different degrees, then what's the sort of the logic behind believing that we're not just seeing the expression of some fundamental human condition in a sense? And so I guess from the policy perspective again, you might want to say, well, actually what we need is not necessarily to or what is achievable is not necessarily to fight something that's a universal human trait, but actually we need to direct it towards more positive forms of consumption, or if you want to call it consumption or whatever, or satisfying your needs, I guess.
And then Graham.
In some ways this is linked. I'm interested, my background is political science, political theory, so I'm very interested here about the link between the value orientation and support for pro-environmental and pro-social interventions, or a desire for different types of social relations. Because having MVO as your value orientation doesn't necessarily mean you'd be against things being different than they are now. So I'm interested in whether you've done any research into people's willingness to support other ways of being, because if there's a strong correlation between materialism and carrying on society being materialist, politically we have a very difficult situation.
Okay, there is some interesting research which relates to both of the first questions, which was funded by UNICEF and headed by Agnes Nairn, actually looking at family dynamics in Sweden, Spain and the UK, and showing there are different cultural contexts which are important. For instance, there's such things as taking greater care of the material goods that you have and repairing them and nurturing them, which was virtually absent in the UK. There were issues around inequality, where both, where Sweden in particular, there seemed to be less social comparison effects, and there seemed to be better childcare, and there seemed to be, so the greater equality within Sweden was actually linked to less worse materialistic effects. So there is quite a lot that could be said about that. And when it comes to the sort of question, well, I mean, the fact that people want, do, and need material goods, I think, is a universalism and not one that should be opposed, but you can use consumer goods in very different ways. You can use them in ways that are much more conducive to positive social interaction. Rather than accumulating them more and more and more, I think what we have found in terms of motivations, if you're trying to repair some, if you like, broken identity or broken relationship, you're a rejected child, everybody hates me, and you feel you have to have all this clobber and then you'll be loved, then you're really on a high to very negative materialism that has ghastly effects. But there are much more positive ways of doing it, and so it's more a matter of making people critical and mindful consumers, or supporting them, making them more resilient. I think that's very important. And in terms of materialism, well, I think people often, why do they stick with it, or are people motivated to stick with it? I think people often haven't been introduced to alternatives. I mean, there's really interesting mindfulness apps for your mobile phone for kids, and they actually get into it. But if you stand there and say, right guys, what we're going to do, you're all going to sit very quietly in your chairs, and we're doing a bit of deep breathing, nothing's going to happen at all. The kids go, oh my God. So you can't obviously approach it like that. You have to do it slightly differently, but apparently it's been hugely successful. So you have to find good ways of introducing people to alternative ways of relating to their wants and their experiences differently, to put it as briefly as I can. I haven't answered that very fully.
Okay, I think we should probably move on. There's been a tour de force. Thank you so much, Helga, for that.
Oh, thank you. I mean, thank you very